Welcome to PLZ Soccer's One-to-One. I'm Peter Martin. I'm delighted to say my one-to-one is with the former head of communications at the SFA, Andy Mitchell, a football historian, a man who loves the sport itself, and of course a back catalogue that I think will be of particular interest to you. Andy, I'm delighted that you could join us on the programme. Of course, football, you were involved in it, working in it, but it's something that you share a real passion with many Scots in the history of it as well.
Yeah, I was very lucky to get a job in football halfway through my working life, having been a huge fan and passionate historian for many, many years. I'd worked in the media and then got a job with the SFA just before the '98 World Cup. Great time to be involved in football, all the excitement of going to France. And I spent 10 years as head of comms.
I've got to ask you this. I mean, you were involved at a time where we actually took qualifying for tournaments for granted, and we had some not bad players.
I know. When I started, you kind of think this is going to be the way of it forever because we had a great track record of qualifying for tournaments and went off to France. I thought this would be a good learning experience. We'll do even better the next time around. And sadly, it's never happened again. So I've got a few memories, I've got a few photos of France, but I kind of wish I paid a bit more attention to what was going on at the time so that I could really savor that moment, just not
Yeah.
appreciating how difficult things would be in the years to come.
And of course, you shared your time there with a man who was equally as passionate about football. I mean, I always kid Craig Brown on about the fact that he was, for many, many years, the last man to get us to a major tournament. That no longer the case, which the country is celebrating. But Craig Brown, equally so, was a man who loved the game. What was he like to work with?
He was excellent because he knew the game inside out. And because I'd come in from outside without a huge knowledge of the football media, he was a great sort of sounding board for everything I needed to do. He showed me the ropes. And I think we worked well together. It was a great loss when he decided to step down. Was it 2001? And I think, although at the time a lot of people were happy to see the back of him, I think that was without any kind of foresight as to what was to come. And of course, uh, we had quite a dramatic slide from grace over the early years of the 2000s, which made, I think, a lot of people yearn for the Craig Brown years, the stability, the excellence that he brought to our game, and the ability to qualify for tournaments.
Yeah, don't worry, I'll get to Bertie in a moment, but
Oh, please.
I've got to I've got to ask you, how did you, I mean, it must have been a culture shock to you to try and take on a post as the head of communications because you have to deal with guys like me and many others who are demanding. Some actually cross the line and don't realise how to conduct themselves. It's a two-way street. Your job's difficult, ours is difficult. Was that a steep learning curve for you?
It was a hugely steep learning curve because although I'd worked in the media for 20 years, I'd trained as a journalist, I'd worked in PR and a whole variety of companies. I'd never been in the front line of the sporting world. And this was just at the start of the digital age. So the traditional model of the newspapers having first dibs at everything with TV a poor second was rapidly being turned on its head. So in the time I was there, the newspapers were rapidly going towards the back of the queue in favour of the internet, in favour of the digital channels, Sky Sports, and all the other channels that came on board. So that was quite a big change that I encountered in my time there.
And with that in mind, the flip side of this is you have to deal with managers who are not necessarily good for public relations. Was Bertie difficult because of culturally where he was brought up, their style of dealing with the media, him as a person? Was there a whole complexity with Bertie Vogts taking over?
He was a challenging man to work with, and I suppose the best thing I can say is I survived. I was still there when he left. When he first came on board, I mean, he was huge change. It was a big change for him too. You've got to remember coming to Scotland, but he wanted to introduce a lot of new ideas, new ways of working. He realised he had to rebuild the Scotland team. Um, but it was difficult on the media side of things. There were a lot of issues because he understood how media worked from Germany. Things work differently in Scotland. And I just had to be the sort of buffer between him and the press a lot of the time and hope he didn't say anything too difficult. But yeah, it was a pressurized time. And of course, when you're working with a football team, any football team, let alone the national team, how you're perceived in the media is utterly dependent on results. And results were not good over quite a long time. So it was a struggle to get through those 2.5 years when he was the national team manager.
What was the most difficult element of it, though? Because obviously the results go against him; he's up against it. But he seemed a fairly, I mean, my recollections of him from many stories was he seemed a fairly bullish person at times, and that must have put a real strain on how you were trying to protect him, but engineer him down a certain road.
He didn't particularly appreciate the Scottish media. I don't know if you were part of that, but in general, he was not too keen on the way the Scottish media behaved. I once remember he was tailed for a week by the News of the World, who covered his every movement. Um, and there were times when, as a press officer, there were surprises thrown up. I remember once coming up to a Scotland team training session, and the media were waiting for the team to come out and do training. And he looks at them and said, "Why are the media here?" And I said, "Well, it's because we've agreed it. It's in the schedule." He said, "No, tell them to go. We don't train until they go." So unfortunately, you guys and the photographers, cameras, whatever, I had to herd out the stadium so that the training session could take part. And it was little things like that that made life rather difficult. But of course, I was the front man.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Andy, I wasn't one of those journalists who thought it would be a great idea to follow Berti Vogts around for a week. I can think of better things to do with my time, to be perfectly honest with you.
Well, I can tell you, he did actually get a wee bit of revenge on the News of the World because one of the days there was a photographer parked outside his house, and he spotted that the photographer had dozed off. So he carefully sneaked out of the house and went off into town or whatever. And the photographer duly reported back that Bertie never left the house all day. Um, and we were able to show afterwards that, in fact, he had been out and about. So it was a bit of an embarrassment for the News of the World. So there's times like that you can play back and get a wee bit of revenge, but most of the time it's a one-way street. But the one thing I
Yeah.
will say in favour of Bertie, because he did have some redeeming qualities, the players who were there, the players who were there at the time, speak very highly of him. Or most of them do. And if you talk about some of the young guys who were brought into the squad, like McFadden and Fletcher and some of the others, they were given an opportunity which they probably wouldn't have had under a more cautious manager in other times. So you can't say it was all bad. There were, a few um, light moments, but yeah, it was a difficult time. That's the overall summation you can make.
Yeah, for one moment there, I was getting really excited when you said he'd spotted that the photographer had dozed off. I just had this vision that you were about to tell me a story. So Bertie sneaked round the car and let all four tyres down, but it just wasn't. It wasn't
Maybe you
as
should have done.
exciting. Yeah, absolutely, it wasn't as exciting as I
Yeah.
thought it was going to be. Listen, Bertie might have been the downside because of obviously we we were so far away from qualifying for tournaments, but you had other people at Scotland when you were there. I mean, Tommy Burns, one game, yeah. Walter Smith, again, so close. What were your experiences of them?
Well, the great thing about Tommy was he was Bertie's right hand man for all of the 2 years. So it was like the yin and yang of football in that Tommy knew the game inside out, knew the players, all the politics, and so on. So he, he certainly deserved more opportunity than he got than just that one game in charge. And it was a great shame that that wasn't to be. And of course, then sadly never got another opportunity because he was ill and died. Um, However, if you move on to Berti, no, from Berti rather to Walter, who took over, that kind of showed us what we'd been missing. Because from a team that had been floundering around the 70s and 80s in the FIFA World Ranking, within a short space of time, we were back up in the 20s and even in the teens for a while. So it showed that with the right manager in place, things could be turned around. And we did have a good football team in Scotland, and we could qualify or come close to qualifying. So the, the overall lesson from that is that the choice of national team manager is incredibly important. You can't just take a random bunch of guys and turn them into a national team. You really need that skill, and Walter was definitely the man for that job.
Yeah, I'm heartened to hear you talk about Tommy that way. I was a good friend of Tommy's. Did you really feel it would have been a good move to make him the manager? Is it something that you think would have been a good decision by the SFA? And were you amazed that they didn't go down that route?
It's hard to say. I can't remember who the other candidates were. I think against Tommy, obviously, must have been Walter at the time. So a very strong field of candidates. Whether Tommy was perhaps tainted by his association with Berti, I don't know because I wasn't involved in the interview process, and I can't really say. But yeah, my gut feeling is that he would have been a very good manager of Scotland on his own, and I think he desperately wanted the job too.
Favourite Scotland player? Is there one that sticks in your mind?
Well, I'm a great fan of Paddy and Fletch and the players in that era because inevitably when you're working with a team staying in the hotel, you get to know people quite well. And on the whole, I got on pretty well with most of the players. They were a good bunch of guys. Um, I couldn't pick out an absolute favourite because as a press officer, a lot of how much you like players depends on how good they are with the media, not necessarily how good a footballer they are. So you can get to know a player who's always willing to do the media stuff, who doesn't trip up, who doesn't let you down, and that's the kind of player I like. And to give you a couple of examples with Darren Fletcher, when he first came into the Scotland squad as a 19-year-old, I introduced myself to him and said, "Look, can you do the press conference, pre-match press conference, and speak to some of the press?" And he says, "Oh, do I have to?" I said, "Well, yeah, all the players do. It's part and parcel." He said, "Okay, fair enough." So he sat down, spoke to the press, batted away the difficult questions, said, "No, I can't really talk about Man United. I'm here on Scotland duty." And I thought that was really good. So I spoke to him after and said, "That was great. Do you get media training at Man United?" And his answer was, "No, I've never done a press conference before. That was my first time." So he was a natural. He knew what to do, which was great. The other side of the coin is you like it at the team hotel. You've told all the press who's coming to the press conference, and you go looking for the player who's due to be there at 2 o'clock, and you find him at 5 to 2, and he said, "Oh, actually, Andy, no, I'm not going to do it. I can't do it. I've just changed my mind. Getting somebody else to do it." So, as a press officer, you're running around desperately trying to find someone who's available, who at 2 minutes' notice can speak to a bunch of journalists. So. That's far more how my relationship with the players was based rather than how skillful they were on the pitch.
And as a football fan, is there a game that sticks in your memory that you just thoroughly enjoyed?
Well, we'll always have Paris. And in my case, Paris twice over because we had the opening match of the World Cup in '98, which was just all the razzmatazz. Were you there yourself?
No, I didn't get to the one in the opening
Okay.
match, but I certainly had a part to play in the one in the Parc des Princes in the James McFadden
Yeah,
goal.
sure. Well, the opening match of the World Cup, it was just being pitch side because I actually got to sit on the Scotland bench or right beside the bench that one, so I was right down the heart of the action. Before the game started, even there was people just milling around, and lo and behold, Sean Connery turns up next to Jackie Stewart, and they wanted to shake hands with the players. So you get to meet people like that. Um, and then the other side of it was in fact, my last match as Scotland press officer was the 2007 victory in Paris, the McFadden goal, and your famous commentary on the radio, which has been much played. Um, and just being part of that, going in the dressing room afterwards, just the euphoria was phenomenal. So a great way to be involved in football. So there you are, two matches in Paris, which really stand out for me.
Yeah, and I look at some of the books that you've been involved in. You know, you've written about the first football club, international football, football's first superstar. So come
Mm-hmm.
on, Andy, who really invented the game? I mean, give us the inside track in this.
Well, the English wrote the rules, but we basically took it over. And modern football today would not be the same without the Scots. From dominating international football in the 1870s when it first started, the guys who went down to England to really show them how to play. Um, if you've ever watched the English game, which I worked on a little bit, you've got guys like Fergie Souter, Jimmy Love, the first professionals, because the English were sort of floundering along with how to play the game in the 1870s, getting bogged down with their their muscular approach to it. It wasn't a free flowing game. And then Scots guys came down and said, "Look, this is how we play it. We pass the ball, we make it entertaining. Uh, Skill will win this game, not just brute strength." Um, so whilst we didn't write the original rules here in Scotland, I think the world game would be totally different if the Scottish skill hadn't come into it, and the passing game that we introduced in the 1870s, 1880s, that really made football what it is today. And we haven't looked back since.
Well, forgive me for suggesting that even as a head of communications and working for UEFA, you at times obviously have to be guarded, professional. You know,
Always.
a safe pair of hands. Let me take you to your family life. Four kids, a mum and dad. Seems all idyllic and normal. What was it like growing up?
Um, Growing up, they're just mum and dad. It's only later on in life that you start finding out about their backstory. And it's still gobsmacks me as to what both my parents achieved in the Second World War while they were um, barely out of school. Um, my dad was in the army, um, landed in France a few weeks after D-Day in charge of a little scout car. He was only 19 at the time, spent his 20th birthday in hospital, um, recovering from a shrapnel wound to his face. That autumn, he moved with the advance through Europe, Western Europe, um, the autumn of 1944, liberated a Dutch village on a bicycle, which is a great story, but you can read up on it. And eventually was in the final assault on Germany. He was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery under fire. So all this by the time he was 20. And I think of myself at 20, I just don't know how I could even have considered doing that. And yet he was able to really do some fantastic uh, things at a young age, and that responsibility and that courage that he showed. At the same time, my parents hadn't met then, but my mother was had just graduated with a maths degree and was recruited by the Foreign Office to work at Bletchley Park, the heart of the code breaking centre. And she spent 2 years involved in the deciphering of Enigma codes at Bletchley Park. She was sometimes shift leader in the famous Hut 6 at Bletchley, um, and played a pretty key role in all that code breaking work that went on which was reputed to have shortened the war by a couple of years. The irony being she wasn't able to talk about it for many years. She didn't even tell my dad. until the 1970s when the secret started to come out. But there you are. You have two parents who both sadly passed away now, but they have a fantastic backstory, which no doubt influenced me in terms of my early life and safe pair of hands, as you call it, the responsibility.
Well, it's utterly gobsmacking for me. When I read the story, I mean, obviously the Enigma, Alan Turing, the whole group of people who were there trying to break, the German codes. It's an utterly amazing story, even more so. But I love reading up and looking into the history of the Second World War. And then, of course, once the movie came out, it heightened everybody's interest in a story that maybe wasn't as famous as it should have been. I'm gobsmacked by the fact that your mum Anne keeps that from your dad. I mean, that must have been how. I mean, did she just not mention it, and then eventually one day just sprang the surprise?
I know it was funny that she said, in those days you signed the Official Secrets Act, and that was it. You didn't tell anybody, and that's what you did. And she wasn't alone. There was about 10,000 people worked at Bletchley, and they all kept it a secret for many, many years. They were just had it drummed into them that you don't talk. But when she could talk, she relished it, and she gave lots of illustrated lectures. She was interviewed lots of times. Um, I think that her last interview was on STV when she was about 91, and then she was interviewed for books, Bletchley Girls, and other histories. So once it was able to come out, she was able to tell people about it, and she really enjoyed the fact that something that she had kept hidden for so long actually could now be revealed and appreciated.
Yeah, as an individual, yourself, and of course your three other siblings, there must have been a tremendous amount of pride. I mean, for me, I would have been sitting there, on the carpet, watching my mum on the couch, telling the story, open mouth. What was it like?
I mean, it was just fascinating because the more you probed, the more detail you got out of her and all the stories. I mean, she was quite insistent that a lot of the work they did was quite boring because you're sitting there just with strings of numbers and letters in front of you and trying to decipher them. But the impact that work had and the dedication it took was astonishing. So yeah, huge amount of pride from all of us into what she achieved, and we can only look back with thanks as to the fact that people were so dedicated and were prepared to just put themselves at the mercy of the national interest and to do what was ever was necessary to win the war.
And in a strange sort of way, Andy, the way life is going now, the way society is, and the change, it's hard to believe in 2021. Um, women are still looking for an equality, a fair treatment, certainly a fair balance on wages and opportunities. But your mum really was a trailblazer. I mean, I know she would maybe have oversimplified it by saying, well, we're looking at a lot of mathematical equations. But even when she started out in an era where, women trying to have a career was frowned upon. I mean, I think I read somewhere that, her headmistress said to her, maths is not very ladylike.
Uh, that's true. She was discouraged at her school from going to university just at all, or let alone to study maths. So yeah, that was quite a big call for her. But her own parents were very encouraging. Um, they had quite a modern ideal. I mean, going quite back into family history, but in the uh, in the 1920s, my her parents, my grandparents, uh, set up one of Britain's first family planning clinics in Oxford, and were roundly condemned by the local community. But they were determined that this was important work that needed to be done uh, to help women. So she came from a background where you didn't just do what you were told, but you were able to think for yourself and to get on with your life and follow the path you want to follow. And I think some of that has been transferred down the generations.
Yeah. Was there a moment where your brothers and sisters, you sat there and your mum and dad said, look, Here's a story you might not have heard. Is there a defining line in the sand where they said, "Listen, I was part of a team that solved a major code breaking, and I was also a part of a team that liberated, an area of Holland and helped in the Second World War. And by the way, here's this medal." I mean, can you remember that? Please tell me there was a specific day, Andy.
I've got to disappoint you there, Peter. It didn't quite happen like that. But yeah, it was a gradual sort of exposure of all the facts as they came out. But you got to remember, also there we were as a teenager, for instance, being told these things. When you're a teenager, you maybe have some other things on your minds. I suppose it took a bit of time for it to sink into me quite how important she was. But my goodness, by the time we knew the whole story, we were very, very proud of what they both achieved and everything that they contributed.
With that in mind, I mentioned that your mum would have been an inspiration. The back catalogue from your grandparents to your mum and dad, and the history and their involvement in it is unbelievable, and something I'm sure, and you can tell by your voice, you're unbelievably proud of it. It didn't just end there. I mean, your mum and dad went on to contribute after that while you guys were growing up as well.
Oh, very much so. Obviously, we're talking about youthful experiences in wartime, and after the war ended, they had to make their lives from there. So my father got a job in the civil service and ended up being a senior civil servant in Scotland. He was head of the Scottish Education Department by the time he retired. My mother went into social policy research and wrote a lot of papers on divorce, the effects of divorce on children, which was quite groundbreaking at the time. And it's acknowledged that the research she did helped to change the law in Scotland as to how children should be taken into account when people are divorcing. Because previously it was all very much in the interests of the parents and settling things between them. But she really made it known that the children had to be taken into account as well. And now that is what happens. So they both had an impact in many different fields. They outside of work, they were both hugely interested in genealogy, which helps to generate my interest in history as well. And they were both very active in all sorts of committees and work outside of their day-to-day lives. So very active people.
Before you go, being a football fan myself, I love looking at footballers, whether they're on the Scottish stage or the European stage or the world stage. You've been around with UEFA as well. You've witnessed some games. You grew up loving the game. Is there a particular team and an individual on a global stage that you have idolised or admired or watched and thought special?
Quite a few. It's a funny part of the work I've done in that I've bumped into and spoken to people like David Beckham or Cristiano Ronaldo, but it's very often in the context of saying, "Could you stand here, please, because this is your Sky interview," or "Could you stand there for BBC?" When it comes to watching football, I've just got to go back to my youth because I grew up in Edinburgh watching the great Hibs team of the early 1970s. So if I was going to pick out people that I really wanted to see play again, it would be the likes of Pat Stanton, Jimmy O'Rourke, Alec Cropley, and so on, because they're the ones who gave me my love of football back in the early 70s, and I've got a lot to be grateful to them for.
And I presume that 7-0 game will stay in your mind forever.
I ran all the way home from Tynecastle. I was so delighted. I had such a great day that day. So thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah, absolutely, and luckily enough, as in my travels all over Scotland, I got to know more than a few of that great Hibs side. They were absolutely magnificent to watch. A fantastic side who should have won far more than they did. That's for certain. Andy, it's been an absolute joy chatting to you. I mean, the stories were fantastic. Long may you continue to prosper, even on a freelance basis. I know exactly how difficult it is, Andy. But listen, thank you for joining me on this one-to-one. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for your company.
Thank you very much, Peter. Bye for now.